Everyone says Perturabo sold out, that the great engineer, the Primarch who built siege works the Imperium itself couldn't replicate, looked into the abyss and became just another demon prince kneeling to the Ruinous Powers. Another slave with a crown. And for a long time, that was the story people accepted, because the surface evidence supports it. In mid-019.M31, following the Battle of the Iron Cage on Sebastus IV, Perturabo underwent transformation to demonhood. The Iron Warriors sacrificed the gene seed of the fallen Imperial Fists to the Chaos Gods. Perturabo was elevated. Case closed. Except the lore keeps doing something strange. Thousands of years later, in the 41st millennium, you find Perturabo in a firm but far from friendly alliance with Vashtorr the Arkifane, a demonic demigod who rules the Forge of Souls, collects the souls of engineers and makers, and operates completely outside the jurisdiction of the four Chaos Gods. The Arks of Omen, Vashtorr supplement, states it plainly. Vashtorr and Perturabo, Daemon Primarch of the Iron Warriors, had collaborated on many nightmarish projects over the millennia. Vashtorr calls him the Lord of Iron. Perturabo lends him Iron Warriors for assaults on fortress-monasteries. Millennia of collaboration between an engineer-primarch and the warp's demon of invention. The one entity in all of chaos who runs on contracts instead of corruption. That isn't incidental. That is a relationship with architecture. The official GW Scouring timeline describes Perturabo's transformation to demonhood simply, without naming which patron or power granted it. Primary sources reference the Dark Gods collectively. No Games Workshop publication explicitly assigns the label Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided to Perturabo, using those exact words. That attribution comes from the inference layer of community documentation, not from the source texts. The gap is small, but it's real, and it's exactly the kind of gap that a careful reader notices. The argument this script builds is this. Perturabo isn't a demon prince of Chaos Undivided in any traditional sense. He is a demon prince operating under Vashtorr's patronage within the Forge of Souls, a deal that preserved his agency as an engineer, explains his deep entanglements with the Dark Mechanicum, and forms a triangle of mutual ambition that Games Workshop has scattered across the lore in breadcrumbs without ever connecting the line. This isn't confirmed canon. GW has never stated it explicitly. What they have done is leave evidence that fits no other interpretation as cleanly, and we're going to lay it out. But to understand why the deal makes sense, you first have to understand who Perturabo actually is. He was discovered on Olympia, a world of warring city-states, and raised in its strife-ridden courts. Official sources describe him as a grim warrior and master of technological arcana, who wielded logic and reason as weapons. He could calculate siege trajectories, solve engineering problems, and run tactical probability assessments simultaneously. His gift wasn't destruction for its own sake. It was the application of precise, overwhelming, calculated force to break things that should have been unbreakable. Mathematics as a language. Fortification as a form of self-expression. The act of building, not the act of killing, as the thing that made him feel like himself. The Emperor used that gift as a blunt instrument. Throughout the Great Crusade, the Iron Warriors were assigned to the most grinding, attrition-heavy campaigns. The sieges nobody else wanted. The fortifications that would cost thousands of lives to crack. The wars of pure attrition that won no glory because they simply had to be won. Other legions took planets and got their names sung in pans. The Iron Warriors bled out in trenches, filed through choke points, died in corridors, and were reassigned to the next identical hellhole before the previous one was cold. Perturabo felt used. Not merely neglected, used. Deliberately, repeatedly, instrumentally used. That wound isn't a secondary character note. It's the central wound that every major decision in his story flows from. His relationship with technology reflected the same psychology. He had a productive working relationship with the Cybernetica branch of the Mechanicum, the division that built robots and treated technology as craft rather than prayer. Robots were honest. Robots performed predictable functions. Robots didn't require liturgical appeasement. But the orthodox priests of Mars, the ones who treated every machine as a sacred mystery and every repair as a ritual incantation, Perturabo held them in contempt. He didn't want a religion around technology. He wanted mastery of it. There is a difference, and it isn't a subtle one, between a man who worships fire and a man who understands combustion. Perturabo had nothing but impatience for the former, and he spent the Great Crusade surrounded by them. The Horus heresy didn't change that psychology. It broke the structures around it, and then it broke the structures around those. Perturabo sided with Horus for reasons as pragmatic as they were bitter. He felt marginalized by the Imperium, saw an opportunity to matter on his own terms, and made the calculation a man of his temperament would make, that aligning with Horus was the move that maximized his autonomy. But the heresy gave him something he hadn't calculated for, an unobstructed view of what chaos actually does to a person. During the events of Angel Exterminatus, Perturabo witnessed Fulgrim's demon ascension firsthand. Fulgrim, already possessed by a Slaanesh demon at this stage, stabbed him with a poisoned blade, an act of betrayal from a brother who was no longer himself. The psychological specificity of that moment matters. Perturabo, by the time of the heresy's end, had watched the one person he trusted after witnessing Fulgrim's transformation, Horus, betray him too. Every structural relationship that could have made him feel safe, recognized, or valued had been dismantled. His response to witnessing Fulgrim's possession and the subsequent knife in his side wasn't grief for Fulgrim. It was the cold registration of a variable confirming what he'd suspected, that chaos didn't recognize its instruments as anything other than instruments. He reportedly withdrew from the Siege of Terra during its final stages, when Horus began relying primarily on demonic forces, viewing that dependence as irrational, the outsourcing of decisive operations to variables he couldn't predict or control. The specific timing of that withdrawal isn't precisely confirmed in primary sources, but the character logic is so consistent that it reads less like fan inference and more like the only thing he would do. A man who had spent his entire life controlling siege variables down to the millimeter does not hand off his culminating campaign to entities that operate on appetite rather than calculation. Then came the Iron Cage, Sebastus IV. It's worth sitting with the precision of what Perturabo built there. This wasn't a standard defensive fortification. This was a siege trap designed by the greatest siege engineer who ever lived, calibrated specifically for the psychological profile of one target, Rogal Dorn, his great rival, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, the other master of fortification in the Imperium. Perturabo had spent decades accumulating resentment toward Dorn, toward the man whose reputation for defensive genius was treated as the gold standard, while Perturabo's offensive genius was treated as a useful but unglamorous tool. The Iron Cage wasn't a battle plan. It was a precise instrument of psychological destruction, dressed in stone and steel. Every corridor was a funnel. Every open space was a kill zone. Every apparent escape route was a longer path to the same killing floor. It had a name. Perturabo gave it a name because he was proud of it the way a craftsman is proud of work that represents his best thinking. Rogal Dorn took the bait. Racked with guilt over the Emperor's survival in a coma aboard the Golden Throne, he entered the trap with the Imperial Fists. The losses were catastrophic. The bodies of over 400 battle brothers were never recovered from Sebastus IV. The Imperial Fists, pride of the Imperium, walked into the mouth of what Perturabo had built and were fed through it. On pure tactical execution, on the merits of what he'd constructed, Perturabo had won. Rabute Guilliman arrived with Ultramarines. The Iron Warriors withdrew into the Eye of Terror. That withdrawal is the part that tends to get skipped over, and it shouldn't. Perturabo had just engineered one of the most lopsided asymmetric victories in the post-heresy period. He'd achieved exactly the revenge he wanted against Dorn, inflicted losses the Imperial Fists would never fully recover from psychologically, and demonstrated that his genius was precisely as formidable as he'd always claimed. And he still had to run. He still had to retreat, not because Dorn had beaten him, but because a third party with superior numbers arrived and changed the math. Even his greatest triumph was incomplete. Even this was taken from him before he could fully own it. In the aftermath, on the border of the Eye of Terror, the Iron Warriors sacrificed the gene seed of the fallen Imperial Fists to the Chaos Gods, and Perturabo was elevated to demonhood. The official GW Scouring timeline confirms the date, mid-019.m31, on Sebastus IV, and describes the transformation simply. Perturabo ascended to demonhood, without naming a patron, without specifying who elevated him, without the explicit phrase, Chaos Undivided, in any primary Games Workshop source from that event. They drew the moment and left the mechanism blank. That gap is the crack in the wall. Before we go through it, the frustration of the purist reading deserves its time, because the people who hold it aren't wrong to hold it. Their argument is this: Perturabo didn't need to become a demon prince. He could have found a different path. The lore contains at least one precedent for a Primarch transcending his limitations through the warp without accepting corruption from the Ruinous Powers. Corvus Corax, the Ravengard Primarch, master of shadow and void, reportedly underwent a transformation connected to his innate warp sensitivity that represented something like an unlocking of his full potential, a deepening of what he already was, rather than a replacement of it by something external. Some sources describe this as a Corvidine transformation, a kind of evolution into something neither purely human nor fully demonic, something native to Corax rather than grafted onto him by a patron god. The honest caveat here is that the lore on this is genuinely thin. The Corax thread has significantly less textual support than the Vashtorr thread. It lives in the space of suggestion and inference rather than explicit statement. The argument that a similar path was available to Perturabo, that the Imperium, or the Warp, or Perturabo's own inner architecture contained a route to transcendence that didn't require kneeling to anything, is more emotionally coherent than it's evidentially solid. It lives in the space of what could have been, but the feeling behind it's legitimate and worth naming precisely. Perturabo is, pound for pound, one of the most intellectually interesting Primarchs in this setting. A genius who understood mathematics as a language, who built things as a form of inner expression, who was denied recognition not because he failed, but because the Imperium never knew how to deploy him as anything other than a mechanism. The vision of him finding a path to transcendence that reflected who he actually was, not a demon prince of any power, but something sui generis, something that was purely and entirely Perturabo, is a compelling alternate history. The frustration that he didn't take it's real, even if the lore never quite promises that it existed. The Vashtorr theory might be the answer to that frustration. Not the answer that says Perturabo stayed clean, but the answer that says he did something more interesting than simply submitting. Vashtorr the Arkifane was introduced in the Arks of Omen supplement series beginning in 2022. Games Workshop's own Warhammer community page titled its reveal article with specific language. Strike a bargain with Vashtorr the Arkifane, the most honest demon you'll ever meet. That framing wasn't accidental. He is classified as a demonic demigod, something between a greater demon and a full chaos god, occupying a tier of power that sits below the four ruinous powers but above anything that serves them. He rules the Forge of Souls, a demonic forge located in the formless wastes of the realm of chaos, a region unaligned to any of the four gods. He does not serve Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, or Tzeentch. He supplies all four with grotesque war engines, which keeps each of them from being the first to move against him. In the taxonomy of the Great Game, official lore describes him as an arms dealer, an agent of no single power, a precarious ally to all of them. His origin, according to GW narrative designer Wade Price, is that he formed from the mortal desire to create, manipulate, and invent, to make things that didn't already exist. He came into existence independently in the warp. The Arks of Omen lore places him as older than the Horus Heresy by what it describes as millions of years, a cosmological span that means the framework for a Vashtorr-mediated deal existed in the warp's architecture long before Perturabo was even created on Olympia. His domain, the souls he collects, the entities he empowers, are specifically inventors, engineers, scientists, and artisans. Official lore states he is empowered by the ceaseless inquiring of mortal minds, and that he embodies the mortal need to understand and then enslave natural forces to one's will, and to eventually achieve technological apotheosis at any cost. His dealing style is what makes him structurally unique in the warp. Unlike other demons, it isn't in Vashtorr's nature to lie, trick, or deceive. His contracts are explicit in their conditions. GW describes his mind as clockwork. He prefers carefully worded contracts that, while never fair, always grant exactly what they promise. The trap Vashtorr sets isn't deception, it's self-interest. He accumulates power not by tricking his partners, but by letting the monomaniacal nature of the entities themselves increase their soul debt with every defeat they suffer. The contract is real, the cost is real, and the cost grows. His goal is apotheosis. He wants to become the fifth major chaos god. Every deal, every collaboration, every nightmarish project with every major player in the warp is a transaction moving him toward that threshold. He needed the key, a weapon with power over the galaxy's destiny, and to get it, he allied with Abaddon the Despoiler, working together toward that ultimate aim. Every relationship Vashtorr has is a step in the same direction, accumulating the soul weight of makers until he crosses the threshold into godhood. Now hold that profile against Perturabo's, a Primarch contemptuous of religious mysticism, who believed in mastery over dependence, who watched chaos corrupt and destroy everyone he trusted and found the process repellent, who held the Mechanicus in contempt specifically for treating knowledge as theology, who resented subjugation in every form it ever took. A man whose deepest psychological wound was being used as an instrument by people who didn't recognize his genius as genius, who assigned him tasks that fit his capabilities while denying him the acknowledgement those capabilities deserved. What kind of deal does a man like that make with the warp? He doesn't surrender to Khorne. Violence as purpose, without calculation, is everything Perturabo found degraded in how the Emperor used him. He doesn't dissolve into Slaaneish's pleasure spiral. Sensation without engineering has no appeal to a man whose pleasures are solved problems and built structures. He doesn't accept Tzeentch's labyrinthine manipulations. Perturabo builds the labyrinths. He doesn't get lost in them, and he has watched Tzeentch's manipulation destroy Magnus, who was arguably smarter than any of them. He doesn't succumb to Nurgle's embrace of entropy and decay. That is the philosophical opposite of what Perturabo is, which is the imposition of order on chaos, structure on void, permanence on ruin. But Vashtorr? Vashtorr doesn't ask for devotion. He doesn't demand worship. He doesn't reshape your mind or corrupt your body as a byproduct of his blessing. He offers a contract, explicit in its terms, in which the party receives exactly what it agreed to. His domain is makers. His power source is the desire to create and master. He is old enough, independent enough, and valuable enough to every chaos power that a demon prince housing himself within Vashtorr's framework would inherit some of that structural protection, too entangled with the arms dealer to be cleanly claimed by any single patron god. Perturabo is the greatest engineer in the history of a galaxy-spanning civilization. If Vashtorr collects the souls of makers, what is Perturabo worth to him? The Forge of Souls is the middle term in this equation. It sits in the formless wastes, outside the territorial claims of any of the four powers. It produces nightmare war engines for all four chaos gods simultaneously. It's, structurally, the one place in the warp where a demon prince with engineering expertise could operate without being effectively owned by a patron. A Primarch established within Vashtorr's domain would have the same structural immunity Vashtorr himself maintains. Too useful to any single god, too entangled with all of them, to be simply claimed or consumed. For a demon prince who needs a home in the warp where he isn't property, that arrangement has significant appeal. More than significant. It's the arrangement that fits. The canonical evidence for this framework isn't direct, and that needs to be said clearly rather than papered over, but it's more than circumstantial. The Arks of Omen Vashtorr supplement records that Vashtorr and Perturabo had collaborated on many nightmarish projects over the millennia. Not one project, not a single campaign. Millennia of collaboration. A relationship that spans the entire post-heresy period of roughly 10,000 years. Vashtorr calls him the Lord of Iron, a title of professional respect, the form of address one significant entity extends to another, not the condescension of a god toward a servant. When Vashtorr needed forces for his assault on the Rock, the Dark Angel's fortress monastery, Perturabo provided iron warriors, not because Vashtorr commanded it, because they had an alliance. That reads as a working partnership between near equals, not a primarch executing a patron's orders. Contrast it with how the other traitor primarchs ascended, and the shape becomes clearer. As a pattern, those ascensions share one quality. They happened to their subjects rather than being chosen by them. Mortarion spent his entire life constructing his identity around resistance to corruption in every form. Resistance to plague, resistance to weakness, resistance to dependency on anything he couldn't control himself. He was raised on Barbarous, a poisoned world where toxic mists killed everything that climbed too high, and he became the man he was specifically because he refused to stop climbing. Forced into Nurgle's embrace by plague warfare, suffering through the exact vector that had always been his vulnerability, Mortarion became the most perfectly corrupted demon prince in the setting, and he became it while resisting with everything he had. That is the tragic irony of his arc. The demon prince who most hated corruption became the most corrupted, through the exact mechanism he most dreaded, in the most complete possible way. His resistance was the material Nurgle worked with. The other forced ascensions, Angron's culmination of what the butcher's nails had already made him, Fulgrim's possession predating his formal apotheosis by years, Magnus's manipulation beginning before the heresy even started, follow the same structural pattern. Entities acted upon, variables taken out of their own hands. Perturabo's situation, per recent The End and the Death material, reportedly has him experiencing significant distress at the prospect of demonhood, viewing it as equivalent to slavery, describing his original plan as an attempt to become a perfect weapon that failed and resulted in unwilling elevation. That account directly conflicts with the older reading, which framed the Iron Cage sacrifice as a deliberate strategic choice. The conflict is real, and the honest position is to hold both. That primary GW sources support a contested reading of whether the ascension was voluntary, and that neither resolution eliminates the Vashtorr question, because the question isn't whether Perturabo wanted demonhood in the abstract. The question is what terms he secured for it. If he chose it deliberately, the Vashtorr deal was the negotiation that made it palatable. He accepted elevation only because he'd secured the right patron and the right framework. If he was pushed into it against his will, the Vashtorr relationship is the mechanism by which he clawed back control afterward. A man who couldn't stop the transformation, but who spent the next 10,000 years building an arrangement that approximated the freedom he'd been denied. Both versions arrive at the same destination, a demon prince whose operational mode is contract rather than submission, whose deepest relationship in the warp is with the one entity who doesn't lie, doesn't manipulate, and gives you exactly what you agreed to. Now here is where the theory must be honest about its own vulnerability. There is a problem with this reading of Perturabo, and it's the same problem Perturabo himself has. He thinks he is in control. Post-Ascension lore shows him on Medrengard, his demon world within the Eye of Terror, surrounded by iron warriors engaged in what amounts to an endless competitive fortress construction exercise. An entire planet organized around the psychology of a man who needs to build, to dominate, to outperform. He works Nurgle's 8 rituals of possession against enemies instrumentally, perverting them rather than performing them as worship. He runs campaigns according to his own timeline. His current grand plan for the conquest of the Imperium, which official lore states has taken thousands of years to formulate, and whose first step is bringing the Cadian Gate under his complete dominion, proceeds on his schedule, not anyone else's. From inside his own perspective, every action is deliberate and calculated and controlled. But chaos corruption doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive wearing the label of subjugation. It arrives as the gradual normalization of things you told yourself you'd never do, each step justifiable from inside the logic of the step before it. The man who says he uses Nurgle's rituals as a tool without devotion is making the same claim as a man who insists he uses something only for tactical purposes and can quit whenever he decides to. He has it under control. He is the master of it. Vashtorr's transactional style is, and this is where the geometry of the trap becomes interesting, potentially the most elegant version of this dynamic possible. He doesn't lie. His contracts give exactly what they promise. But what Vashtorr collects isn't labor, it's souls. And the soul debt of entities in his service increases with every defeat they suffer. Perturabo has been fighting continuously for 10,000 years. He was forced to retreat from the Iron Cage when Guilliman arrived with superior numbers. He was reportedly forced to withdraw from the Temple of Ascension during the War of Rust and Ruin, driven back by Mortarian's plague warfare despite his superior firepower. Every loss within Vashtorr's contractual framework isn't merely a tactical setback, it's compounding interest. Vashtorr needed an asset of Perturabo's magnitude for the same reason any entity seeking apotheosis would need him, because becoming a fifth chaos god requires the kind of soul weight that only comes from collecting the greatest makers who ever existed. A Primarch who is also the galaxy's finest engineer, operating inside the Forge of Souls framework for 10 millennia, building and fighting and losing and building again, that isn't a subordinate. That is Vashtorr's most significant investment, growing in spiritual value with every defeat that compounds the debt. The greatest engineer in history, potentially building the most elaborate trap ever constructed, walking into it himself. The structural logic is sitting in the lore. Now the third corner of the triangle, because the Dark Mechanicum isn't a throwaway detail in this picture. It's a load-bearing pillar. The Orthodox Mechanicus and the Dark Mechanicum aren't simply the same organization with different political allegiances. The Dark Mechanicum are heretics who rejected Mars entirely, who pursued forbidden technology, merged flesh and machine beyond the boundaries the Omnissiah set, built demon engines for chaos factions throughout the heresy and the millennia afterward. They lack central authority. They are fractious, decentralized, brilliant, and desperate for frameworks that will let them work without restriction. What they share, across the diversity of their factions and approaches, is a fundamental identity. They are engineers who want to operate without theological constraint, without the liturgy and ritual and sacred mystery framing of the loyal Mechanicus. That is the psychological profile of every person Perturabo has ever respected. Official lore states that the Iron Warriors work closely with Dark Mechanicum heretics and have proven capable of unleashing fiendishly potent new demon engines upon enemies. The relationship isn't arm's length. It isn't incidental. The Iron Warriors and the Dark Mechanicum have a structural alignment that runs deeper than shared political allegiance. They share a worldview, a contempt for the same institutions, and a practical need for each other's capabilities. The Iron Warriors need engineering and demon engine production beyond what any standard Chaos Warband can provide. The Dark Mechanicum need protection, direction, and the kind of Primarch-level martial power that can shield their forge work from rivals. Perturabo's contempt for the Orthodox Mechanicus specifically does not extend to the Dark Mechanicum. Official sources draw that distinction in his psychology. The priests of Mars are a cult masquerading as engineers. The heretics are engineers operating in darkness. One is contemptible. The other is, at worst, an accurate description of what engineering looks like when it has shed the pretense of sanctity. Vashtorr's relationship to the Dark Mechanicum runs through the same transactional logic that governs every relationship he has. Explicit contracts, specific terms, services rendered for souls, and materials provided. The Forge of Souls produces the demon engines the Dark Mechanicum deploys across the galaxy. Vashtorr's war engines require makers to build them, engineers who understand both machinery and warp logic simultaneously. The Forge of Souls is where those two disciplines meet under Vashtorr's authority. The triangle, when you lay all three corners next to each other, has a coherent shape. Perturabo brings engineering genius of Primarch caliber and 10,000 years of post-ascension development, a soul of incalculable value to a demigod collecting makers. Vashtorr gains the most significant engineering soul in the setting's history, accumulates compounding debt over millennia, and advances toward apotheosis. The Dark Mechanicum, fractious, powerful, technically brilliant, lacking the centralized protection of a patron who understands them, finds in Perturabo a figure who shares their contempt for orthodox mechanicus theology, and in Vashtorr's Forge of Souls, a domain where their work can proceed without the Ruinous Powers claiming it as tribute to one specific god. Soul exchange flows in all directions. Every demon engine built in the Forge of Souls feeds Vashtorr's accumulation. Every heretic burning themselves out in service to the Iron Warriors adds weight to the scale. Every nightmarish project Perturabo and Vashtorr collaborate on over the millennia deepens the entanglement. The architecture is there. Perturabo masters without submitting, or believes he does. Vashtorr rises toward godhood by collecting the greatest makers. The Dark Mechanicum finally has a patron who respects craft over ceremony. The Forge of Souls is the nexus where all three ambitions meet. The absence of explicit canonical confirmation deserves direct address, not a footnote. Vashtorr was introduced to the setting in 2022. The events of Perturabo's ascension in 019.M31 were written before Vashtorr existed as a character. Games Workshop couldn't, in the strictest sense, have intended a Vashtorr connection at the moment of that ascension, because Vashtorr wasn't there yet, not in the publication record, and perhaps not fully formed as a concept. What they have done is introduce a character whose every canonical attribute fits Perturabo's psychology and history with a precision that would be remarkable if it were accidental, then confirm a millennia-long collaborative relationship between them without explaining how it began or what its original terms were. 2 points have been drawn. The line between them has been left unpainted. Post-ascension behavior adds texture to the picture. Perturabo working Nurgle's rituals as instruments rather than as acts of devotion is consistent with a demon prince who treats the warp's resources the way an engineer treats materials, things to be understood, applied, and controlled, not things to be worshipped. His conflict with Mortarion over the Temple of Ascension during the War of Rust and Ruin, whatever the temple's true purpose, suggests an ongoing and unresolved relationship with his own demonhood. A man still negotiating the terms of something that either happened to him or that he chose, or both. His current grand plan for the conquest of the Imperium, which official lore states has taken thousands of years to formulate, and whose first step is bringing the Cadian Gate under his complete dominion, reads like a siege campaign running on its architect's own timeline, nobody else's. Every behavioral marker in the post-heresy lore points toward a demon prince operating with unusual autonomy. The question is whether that autonomy is genuine or a very sophisticated illusion that happens to be exactly what Vashtorr's most valuable contractor would believe in order to keep working. The alternative reading, that Perturabo simply submitted, became one more demon prince of Chaos Undivided, kneeled to the same powers he'd watched hollow out Fulgrim and consume Angron, accepted the same subjugation he'd spent his entire pre-heresy life resenting, requires you to believe something specific and somewhat difficult. It requires you to believe that a man who resented being used as a siege engine by people who didn't recognize his intelligence voluntarily agreed to be used as a weapon by entities whose nature is to corrupt and consume. That the engineer chose the version of the story where he is just another instrument. That is a hard sell. Not because Perturabo needs to be sympathetic. He isn't sympathetic. He is a mass murderer who turned a demon world into a prison fortress and has spent 10,000 years in the service of catastrophe. But he is psychologically coherent, and the psychology of this specific man points away from submission and toward transaction. The two aren't the same thing, and the difference between them is the difference between a man who lost himself and a man who made a deal he may not fully understand. A contract, explicit in its terms, with the one entity in the warp who doesn't lie, doesn't manipulate, and will give you exactly what you agreed to. In exchange for what? For himself. For the soul of the greatest maker in the galaxy. Applied to Vashtorr's purposes over the long millennia, it takes a demonic demigod to become a god. Perturabo thinks he got the better end of that deal. He always does. He is, by his own estimation, always the one in control. Always the architect and never the material. The most elegant trap ever built isn't on Sebastus IV. It's the one Perturabo walked into himself, certain he'd understood the blueprints, certain he'd calculated every variable, certain he was the engineer in this arrangement and not the component. The evidence is already in the lore, scattered across Arks of Omen, across the Forge of Souls entries, across the Dark Mechanicum's structural alignment with the Iron Warriors, across the telling gap in the primary GW scouring timeline that never quite named a patron for the transformation at the Iron Cage. Games Workshop drew the shape without connecting the line. But the shape was always there, waiting for someone to read it as the blueprint it's. GW may never confirm this. The explicit statement, Perturabo is a demon prince under Vashtorr's patronage, installed in the Forge of Souls through a transactional deal rather than submission to the four gods, may never appear in print. But the parts that would have to be assembled to make that statement are already in the canon, already confirmed, already pointing toward each other. The millennia of collaboration, the explicit contract dealing style of the only warp entity whose domain covers makers and engineers. The deep structural alliance between the Iron Warriors and the Dark Mechanicum. The primary source ambiguity around what power specifically elevated Perturabo in 019.M31. Someone was always going to make that deal. An engineer who would only accept terms that preserved his agency, dealing with the one entity in all of chaos who offers terms rather than corruption. It was always going to cost him exactly what he thought he'd kept. Subscribe for more lore breakdowns like this, and if you've got a different reading of where Perturabo's deal actually ends, leave it below. The argument stays open until GW closes it.